Good evening, everyone. I pray and hope that you all are doing well. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Kurdish people and their fight for their independence. Well, you might ask me, who are the Kurds? Their population is estimated to be about 30 to 40 million people spanning across the Middle East periphery. So the Kurds are an Iranian ethnic descent, which are native to the mountains and the regions of Kurdistan, which expands around Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So the Kurds are one of the indigenous people of the Middle East and the region's fourth largest ethnic groups. They speak Kurdish and Indo-European language. They are predominantly Sunni Muslims, and they have tribal identities pretty much like people in the northeast part of India. And often they supersede within their tribal bodies, and they normally don't acknowledge or bypass. They bypass most of the time the national allegiance that sometimes sort of overshadow them. They sort of go by their own means. Let's just put it that way. So all right, so we're going to talk about Kurdish people and their independence. So they've been fighting for their independence very much like how many people groups, something like Nagaland and Naga people movement, and you have tribal bodies in different parts of countries, and in India especially, I think there's a lot of independent movements, past and present. So the aspirations of the Kurdish independent movement reflected on a historical and a collective narrative. So for their fight for the independent nations, for their independent nation state, and remain one of the world's largest peoples without a sovereign nation state, so which is practically an independent country. So why I say about the sovereign nation state is very important here, because I think if you look at the international narrative per se, or international relations, you sort of get the gist of it about what the theory aspect of it is, and what are some of the things that a lot of international relations students will talk about and study about. So all right, I think we have a couple of people joining in here, which is great. Thank you for joining in, guys. So the Kurdish nationalism emerged during the 20th century, following the disintegration of the rule of great empires such as the Ottoman Empire and the formation of new nation states across the Middle East. Over the years, it has collapsed due to, due to the Allied forces of the European powers during the First World War. For example, you have France, you have Britain, who had joined forces and agreed upon a sort of a jurisdiction, over the fallen Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was sort of, if you look back in the time period, you would sort of go back into World War I, pre-World War I, So while the lands were mapped by cartographers from Europe and the Western forces, it had definitely given a new sort of a borders, and states. So the Kurdish people were not recognized with a homeland. So this actually happened in India as well, if you think about it. While the British left, they were, I don't know if it was adamant or specific, but they did give a lot of separation for many states after they left. So we are still reaping, sort of their medicine in a way, per se, which is not good. I think there's a lot of rivalry and wars and border issues because of that. So this is particularly related to the Kurdish independence and the Kurdish people and the region. Okay, so it's kind of simple if you think about that. So therefore, like many problems and conflicts obviously evolved over the years. And I think due to the political and also like the strategic places and economic boom and bust and the trade volumes and the people who will benefit from each neighboring places in the Middle East region sort of gave more sort of problems to to the scar or to the sickness, I suppose. So the Kurdish independence movement faces not only domestic disputed problems, but it also affected the international community a lot. So why I say this, because I'll tell you. So the question that I'm going to propose is there an international consensus in regarding the establishment of a Kurdish independent state? Okay, so that is the question, and let's try to press on and sort of delve into some of the nuts and bolts of this narrative. So, speaking of narrative, I think the press and the media and the scholars have definitely been very concerned about the Kurdish independent movement since inception. And I think the most recent one, according to my research, is during November 2022 when Turkey launched Operation Claw Sword. So there has been a high peak of coverage since then. Therefore, in this podcast, I will look into some of the newspapers and online databases. So some sources proclaim that there's this Kurdistan does not exist, okay, which is the independent country. And while the other supporters or other opinions say they exist, okay, so they have an independent claim to it. So therefore, I think one has to look into the history of Kurdistan issue, I think. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong, but I think it's Kurdistan. There is a vast amount of news coverage, okay, in this subject. And I think there has been an objective and an agenda from various news agencies and newspapers and think tanks and countries. So besides that, let's try to find some evidence for a possible international consensus, which is what we're trying. Sorry, I got a call there. Which is why we're trying to find a possible international consensus. So, in the news article, As Kurds I Statehood, a Border Takes Shape, which was retrieved from the international section of the Hindu newspaper. The Hindu newspaper is from the Indian newspaper. So it points out the lands taken from ISIS will remain in Kurdish hands. So to better understand sort of the epistemology and how the issue was constructed over time, I think there is a need for us, like the layman person, to sort of consider the origins of the current crisis, okay, or the overlooming crisis of the Kurds and the independent movement. For example, in the same article, and I'm going to quote here, it was our frontal line, now it's our border, and we will stay forever. Okay, so they're very adamant about it. So the Kurds have been in dispute with the Baghdad government over territory lands stretching across the northern and the eastern and the Iraq issue since 2003. Okay, I think this was after the U.S. led invasion, if I have not mistaken. But okay, so this shows that the disputes among the Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria, continues to be a very hot topic, especially against the Islamic State. But I suppose the battle is waning for some reason. So thousands of Kurds have been killed in battles that shrunk the Islamic State. So there is a footprint to it. There's a bloodshed to it. They have been protecting and fighting for their for their rights. And I think it peaked in 2014, where they sacrificed a lot of people. I think so. If you have been covering the news on the Kurdish independence, I think they definitely were fighting against ISIS group as well. So, for example, the United States had trained Iraqi Kurds, okay, and Syrian Kurds with air power, okay, through, well, notably, there was a clash between Baghdad and which directly provided arms to the Peshmerga. Okay, so Peshmerga is a member of the Kurdish national guerrilla organization, which is sort of like NSCN of NSCN-IM or NSCN-K, whatever faction groups are in Nagaland, or probably in Chhattisgarh, the Maoist faction and all that stuff. So the United States were sort of arming these Kurds, okay, from Iraq and Syria in order to fight the ISIS, okay. So there's a reason why they're fighting for ISIS, because due to the rise of ISIS and the post 9/11, I think these are all sort of progression of a lot of militant group and the Taliban group, and also I suppose terrorists in general. Okay, right. So so they were receiving, like, the Kurds, particularly Iraqi Kurds as well. They were receiving training and weapon trainings and all that kind of stuff, sort from the European countries as well. So meanwhile, the PKK, okay, has also supported the Syrian Kurds with training arms and all that. So basically, a lot of people up in the power, the big countries, they were preparing these Kurds to fight the battle against ISIS. Okay, but there is a political narrative to it that I think it is very important. Maybe it could be for their gains, okay, not necessarily people of the Kurds. So it is for your taking and it's for your understanding. So I'm not the one to say what is right and what is wrong. I'm just postulating the idea of who is right and who is wrong, and who may be intervening in your independent movement. Okay, that is for you to answer that. So again, there's another news article that I was reading by the Associated Press, AP. Okay, so I'm going to quote this. So it said the U.S. So I think the article was titled "U.S. cutting off the supplies of arms to Kurds fighting in Syria," right? Which was an AP Press, and the article sort of points out, okay, that in a phone call Friday with Turkish President Erdogan, okay, U.S. President Donald Trump said he'd given clear instruction that the Kurds will receive no more weapons. Okay, so this was sort of a bummer and off the grid by what Donald Trump had said, and it didn't sort of go well with many Kurds. So it consisted of news story reported, okay, which is pretty much changing the U.S. policies by what Donald Trump had said, okay. By the way, I'm sort of collecting information from different sources and different countries, okay. So it could be, Le Monde, which is the French newspaper, then you have the Times, which is UK, then you have the Hindu, which is an English, sort of a widely read English India newspaper, and I think, and you have the Global Times, and and I think you have the the Council of Foreign Relations, some of the database that I'm citing. So these are some of the database, and I am sort of comparing, contrasting, and sort of a multi-case basis. Okay. Right. So what Donald Trump had said during that time was the changing of U.S. policies for the Kurds, and the irony is that the Global Times, which is the Chinese government newspaper, said that they were more concerned about the Russia and Turkey ties within the region. Okay, so obviously I think everybody knows Russia and Turkey and China, I think, and the Middle East now, they're sort of coming in a unification where there is this de-dollarization and de-petrodollar. Okay, so sort of I think what they're doing is all the Arab countries and China and probably, I don't know about Africa, okay, I'm not very sure because you have to listen to the African Union. But I think what they're doing, according to the news right now, is that they're sort of trading within their own currency and taking off the dollar. Okay, so this is very important, I think, especially people who do trade studies and economic studies, they will understand the weight of it. Okay, and I was reading about what the UK had to say about the Kurdish independent movement. And according to the Times, which is very much UK based, states that Kurdistan or the Kurdish are both terrorists and freedom fighters. So I think it's kind of, they're always, the UK, the English people or the England, they always go in the middle ground, which is, they always try to be in the safe side. So anyways, let me sort of, I read this article by Hagit Ariai, okay, Ariai, which is published in the Council of Foreign Relations. And this is pretty much from an international perspective regarding this issue. So despite the history that we sort of spoke about the marginalization and persecution of many Kurds, and them holding this hope or beam of hope, trying to achieve, the old quest of independence. The Kurds are one of the world's largest people groups without a state or a nation, okay, making up a sizable minority in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. So the history is marked by marginalization and persecution. Okay, so this doesn't actually, it's not just Kurds, but it's many other people or people groups who are fighting for independence. But maybe it's not in the limelight per se. But I think it's a very interesting topic. Then we can draw a lot of conclusions and comparisons to what the Kurdish independence is going through. So the Kurdish group have at times bargained with not only their own government but also neighboring ones, in some cases at the expense of their relations with their Kurdish brethren. So I'm just going to draw this conclusion or comparison because it's very similar to a lot of northeast regions in India where you have a lot of bordering areas, you have a lot of different dialects, different tribes, different languages, and sometimes it clashes, okay? And so what happens is there's a complex relationships, like how the Kurdish brethren are sometimes fighting among themselves for their own benefit, very similar to how people from northeast or bordering in northeast in India and China are fighting for their own benefits. Okay, so I think there is a sort of a political conundrum and a need for intervention that needs to sort of identify this Kurdish problem. So the Kurds disunity is cited by me, of course, right, which I just pointed out some examples, but is also pointed out by some experts, okay, as one of the primary causes for their inability to form their own nation state, country, or state, right? So another is that the landlocked people that are reliant on government that opposes their independence. So if the central government is going to keep pouring money, obviously there's going to be a bunch of, I suppose, you know, pro-centralist or pro-government who are not going to fight for independence. Okay, so it really depends on the motive and the principles they carry, not necessarily for money or for any sanctions or for developments, but for the sake of unity as well, and survival. Okay, that could be argued and debated about. But I think Kurdistan is also very popular with their oil and their natural resources. So I think they are, in a way, probably, I'm not very sure about their resources, but okay, let's move on. Okay, so some researchers, right, such as Martin van Brusen, he pointed out, okay, that while some level of Turkish cultural, social, political, and ideological diversity may exist, the Kurdish community has long thrived over the centuries as a generally peaceful and well integrated part of Turkish society. Well, that is from Turkish society, okay, with hostilities or problems erupting only in recent years. So that's one author or one researcher who pointed that out. And the other one is, okay, probably I'll cut down on some of the researchers, but I'm just going to say their fight and their demand for independent nation state or country certainly is a very complex one, but a very common aspiration, right, for many of us who sort of study about such nationalistic movements, sovereignty movements, and people groups, regions, borders who share a similar sort of a history. I think this is something that is within our reach. So I think, let me sort of close this here. Yes, I've explained to you a little bit about the Kurds' identity, maybe their history and their independent and the political movements, which seems to be a little rough out there. But then some countries and allies might be reluctant, okay, to disagree. For example, maybe some presidents in America, or probably some NATO countries, or maybe India, or maybe I don't know, East Asia. So depending on the nation states within the United Nations body and also the Security Council, I think these groups or these countries or entities, they might disagree on the matter of independence for the Kurdish movement. But I think overall, international support is certainly a critical aspect for intervention of the Kurdistan and the Kurdish people, as these regions and people are landlocked and they're reliant on its neighbors for passage of goods and make peace among their neighboring borders. So I think, in my point of view, or maybe according to my research, I feel like there needs to be an international intervention regarding the Kurdish movement, because they have been fighting for independence for a very long time. And I think they deserve international recognition, international intervention as well by the United Nations. Particularly, I think, since the G20 is happening in India, I think India has a very heavy hand to play here. And they need to sort of raise this issue about the Kurdish independence for the sake of humanitarian aspect as well, okay? Not just for nationalism or any of the sovereignty issue, but from a humanitarian aspect. I think there needs to be peace. That's all I'm saying. All right, guys. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up here, but thank you for joining, guys. I'm going to probably speak about some other topic. So please feel free to join me in my next podcast. All right, okay. I will see you guys next time. Have a good one. Take care.